Okay, so first of all, I want to apologize for my voice and if I have to take a breath or if I start coughing. I've had the flu for a week. Um, but yeah, let's just jump into this. What I want to talk about today is the election of 1860 and the events that led up to that and why it was such an important aspect in American history. Sorry. Going back to events prior to the actual election. You have to understand a lot of the events that happened or that occurred prior to this. Excuse me. Really led up to the election and the events that happened after the election. When we look at the first thing I want to go back a decade is look at the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This really, put fugitive slaves at risk. It put freedmen at risk. Anybody that could be declared a slave and couldn't, thus prove it in front of a judge could be sent back or sent into slavery. And this was an issue for many that got sent back, whether they were free or runaway slaves. But as you progress through, you have the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This essentially creating, nullifying the Missouri Compromise. And now you have, what starts into bleeding Kansas with the fights of trying to determine whether or not these new territories, where they were going to become states, are going to become slave or free. And this causes epic battles and essentially a war within the state of Kansas itself, or the territory of Kansas at the time, to try to determine who was going to become, whether it was going to become free or slave. And this really is important because then you're throwing off the balance of Congress, and that was such a key aspect because representation was so key, and to have that upper hand within Congress would have been monumental for so many people. This also helps form the actual Republican Party in 1854. Now, they start off slow. They're not in really any major presidential race, or they're not a big contender right away. But when you think about this, a political party forming and within 6 years takes the presidency, that's a pretty big step in a short time. But this is what helps start because they are wanting to stop the spread of slavery. And that was one of the things that Lincoln said. One of his main goals was to stop the spread of slavery into new territories where it didn't already exist. Now, moving a little bit forward after the Republican Party has started, there you have John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. Now, this was really key in that it scared Southerners because here's their worst nightmare almost come true. Here's John Brown and leads his sons and others in this raid at Harper's Ferry, where they're going to essentially take over the armory, which they do, and create this slave revolt where they're going to arm the slaves and have them fight against their white owners. And this is something that slave owners had feared for generations. um, Unfortunately for John Brown, it doesn't come to fruition. He does take over the armory. um, you know Ironically, I learned this summer. I actually visited here with my father for the first time this summer, and learned that ironically the first person to die in the raid was a former slave who worked for the railroad. As you see here on the right side, that is the where the armory stood. Eventually, the Union Army, when they left this area, would burn down both buildings. There's one here and one a little bit further in the back that you can't really see in this image. But these were the armories that, the store of arms that John Brown and his men took and held for, a short time. The only thing they couldn't do was, create a slave revolt. No slaves came. He eventually was, captured, arrested, ironically by a young colonel in the U.S. Army, one Robert E. Lee, and he would later be hanged and put to death after trial. The Republican National Convention, when you're going into the 1860 election, you have these front runners, and these are the two big names here. William H. Seward of New York, he was a senator, and former governor of Ohio, Salmon P. Chase. So these two were the front runners for the nomination in the Republican National Convention. But they didn't last very long. Now, when you start to look at the elections here, and this is the voting at the convention. In the first vote, Seward, has this commanding lead. Second vote, he doesn't have enough to take the nomination, but he's growing. But notice where Lincoln is. Lincoln was always in the background trying to become that next guy. Well, if your guy isn't going to win, if your guy is Chase and Chase isn't going to win, well, join the Lincoln team. And with it being in Chicago, with it being in Illinois, here it is in his backyard. He's got people cheering for him. He's got people there, pushing his name and whispering his name and yelling his name, and at every chance that they can. Eventually, you start to see here that by the third ballot, he's taking the lead, and commandingly so. And then after some shifting goes along to that third ballot, he winds up taking the nomination. And this is something that is, quite amazing, especially for, a one-term congressman who, had lost the senatorial, campaigns, earlier in the decade. But really kind of made a name for himself, but was actually out of politics. So, excuse me. So Lincoln takes over the election, the nomination, and he's going to wind up dominating the election based on the territorial divides. You actually have 4 people running for president, and this is one of the keys to Lincoln winning. Lincoln wins every northern state and California and Oregon, hands down. Douglas takes Missouri. He was one that was really highly thought of, and many thought would do well. Breckinridge basically takes the South. And then Bell takes some of the border states in Kentucky and Tennessee and Virginia, but nobody is able to dominate like Lincoln is, and thus Lincoln becomes the presidential nominee. And why this is so important is essentially, many states in the South had said if Lincoln and the Republicans become the winner of the election, that they are going to secede, and that's exactly what happens. So you have all of this buildup with the new laws, the fugitive slave laws. You have Bleeding Kansas and the fight over slavery there. You have John Brown's raid and the scare that he puts into some of the Southerners. You have all of this, and it leads to the Southerners saying, hey, look, if the Republican wins the presidency, then we're going to secede and leave the Union. And that's exactly what happens as soon as he is elected, prior to him even taking the oath of office. Remember, he doesn't take the oath of office until March. This isn't like nowadays where they take it in January. He took it in March. There were already states seceding and leaving the Union. So by the time he enters the office, the South has already left, and this is such a key time in history with all that the accumulating effects that happen here would eventually of course lead to the Civil War. But one of the things that Lincoln was saying his entire time was, hey, I'm not trying to eliminate slavery, but I'm trying to keep it from spreading. So just a little bit about the election of 1860 and the precursors that led up to that. Um, so yeah, appreciate you and have a great day.